You're on 94.1 FM 3WBC with Jerry Guirguis presenting the Egypt Australia Radio Show, a weekly English edition covering local and international news sourced from Australia, Egypt and the Greater Middle East and North Africa region. The program affectionately covers the arts, culture, trade and politics. Sunday evening, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. And now here's Jerry Guirguis presenting the Egypt Australia Radio Show, 94.1 FM 3WBC, the voice of the Inner East.
Hi and welcome to 94.1 FM 3WBC, Egypt Australia Radio Show, with me, Jerry Guirguis, interviewing Mr. Francois Darcas at the from Agri-Oz Exports Australia Pty Limited, here on Thursday, the 21st of March, 2024. Just a brief outline of Mr. Francois. Studied agriculture science and economics in France, studied business in USA, in grain business since 1989, first in USA, then Hong Kong, then France, then Australia in 2001. First exported Chinese broad beans to Egypt in 1992. Started own business in 2013 in Australia with strong focus on export of fava beans to Egypt and focus mostly on pulses export from Australia to Asia and Middle East. Hi and welcome, Mr. Francois.
Hello.
Can I start by highlighting these incredible figures? Now, the Australian fava beans, Francois, and other legumes exported, as you would know, exported to Egypt is one of the great and ongoing trading partnership stories between Australia and Egypt. In fact, in 2016, Egypt imported about 300,000 tonnes of fava beans from Australia to the value of $180 million. That grew by 2021 to 215 million. The price ranged from $300 a tonne in 2014, it grew to $600 a tonne in 2016. The first question I suppose that's come to mind is, with the recent devaluation of the Egyptian pound against the US dollars, quoting roughly about $1 is roughly about 50 Egyptian pounds, how will this affect the trade, sir?
Okay, so we've already seen effects in the last 12 months. So in the crop year 22-23, so our crop years run from October to September roughly. The exports to Egypt dropped from about 500,000 tons the year before to only about 350,000 tons last year. That reflects several things, but to your question, it's really about the decreasing purchasing power of the Egyptian consumer because of the much lower Egyptian pound. So we've seen Australian exports to Egypt, which normally in the last 10 years were in the range of 80-85% of total exports, fava beans to Egypt, dropped to about 75%. So in the meantime, some other markets have emerged, buying more fava beans, such as Vietnam, for example, for fish feed. We've also seen a growing consumption in Australia for the animal feed sector, which reflected other factors like the high price of imported soybean meal or the high price of canola meal produced in Australia. So definitely the pound devaluation is reflected in relative decrease in exports to Egypt. Just the Egyptian consumer is suffering from inflation in general and food inflation, and therefore consuming less.
I just had a recent chat with Mr. Atif Tedros, and putting the question to him also, he's come back and said Egypt will continue purchasing fava beans even if it reaches astronomical $1,000 a ton. So that's a very good insight in saying how consistent Egypt wants to be. Yes, the valuation of the Egyptian pound, like you said, it is something to be watching out for.
Yeah. So what I would comment to that is Atef is right. Fava beans are a staple food in Egypt and really part of the traditional diet. But if we were to reach a price such as $1,000 a ton, yes, Egypt would still buy some, but buy a lot less.
Right. Okay.
You would cut out the lower income consumers would not be able to follow those prices.
Right. That is a very interesting question, and I think the remark was that even the biggest buyer is the government, and the food subsidy in Egypt would take up the slack on that. So we'll see how it goes. But
yeah, well, I would comment on that too. Fava beans are not subsidized by the government in Egypt, and the government is not a buyer or a significant buyer. So wheat is very different. Wheat is purchased primarily by the government and distributed with subsidies. Fava beans not so.
Right. Okay. The United Nations declared, as you would know, 10th of February is the International Day of Pulses. At least we've got a day for the pulses around the world now. And the Australian Farmers Supply, this is incredible and remarkable stats here. Australian farmers supply 90% of fava beans to the world. In fact, 75% of Australian fava beans is shipped only to Egypt, as you've mentioned earlier in your comment. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization projected between 500,000 and 1.5 million tons will be in demand annually, knowing that 2 million tons is produced by China, 1.6 is consumed by China, and you've got the leftover. And 4 million, about 4 million tons of fava beans is consumed annually. These figures are staggering, and it's promising for Australian farmers.
Yeah, so first of all, the first number is not right. Australian farmers do not supply 90% of fava beans to the world. There are exports from Europe. There are exports to non-food markets, such as feed farming in Norway, Northern Europe, Scotland. So I reckon Australia supplies maybe 40% to the world. 75% of Australian exports go to Egypt, so that's a different number. And yes, the biggest producers are China and Ethiopia, but by and large, they consume what they produce. And China, if they could, would import a lot more. But there's at the moment no phytosanitary protocol between Australia and China. So Australian exports to China are not technically feasible, although there is a growing trade of Australian fava beans exported to neighboring countries such as Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, which I strongly suspect end up getting smuggled into China. But China used to be the main supplier to Egypt before Australia developed its production.
Right. Okay. So
and before China became a big consumer themselves.
Yeah, that's the interesting part of the story, Francois, is that you mentioned Vietnam coming on. Are they eating the fava beans, or primarily, or is China eating the fava beans as a fava beans, or are they just consuming it in one form or another?
So Vietnam is always a bit of a question mark, and we do some business to Vietnam. Some exports there go into fish farming. So fava beans are generally liked as a food ingredient or feed ingredient for fish farmers. They
Right.
have good physical properties that make them sort of, after some processing, float nicely for fish to grab. So they're used in Northern Europe, in Norway, in Scotland, where you have big industrial salmon farms.
Yes.
A little bit in Tasmania, and in Vietnam. In Vietnam, they also use faba bean to some extent for some food snacks. And then the dark area is how much finds its way through the border to China. And that's
Yes.
the same. You see export numbers to Thailand and Laos. I do not believe there is any consumption there. It's just a way for some traders to bypass the fact that you cannot export to China directly.
I'm going to get to a part of that remarks narrative later on in one of the questions, but fava beans is fava beans. So what's the difference between the fava beans exported from Australia to the fava beans that's locally grown in Egypt from local countries and other locals, like UK, France, Baltic countries?
Okay, so first of all, that trade happens because faba beans used to be and are still produced in Egypt. So they're called broad beans because they're a little bit of a larger size bean.
Yep.
But Egyptian production has probably decreased over the year with a lack or loss of arable land. You know, in Egypt, cultivation only happens along the Nile River where there is irrigation water. And with growing urbanization, pretty much there's a loss of land. And so, and combined with a fast-growing population in Egypt, Egyptian production has become more and more insufficient. So that is why you have a large production in Australia. Why Australia is preferred over, say, beans from Europe? Several reasons. I think the agricultural research community in Australia has done a very good job in identifying the traits that are liked in Egypt, which is a larger size bean, nicely colored. So our beans are preferred to the European ones. And also Australian beans 99.9% of the time come without any insect problems, which is not the case in Europe. And Europe has I guess they've shot themselves in the foot with recent policies banning some insecticides in Europe. They have really decreased the quality of the production. So it's very hard to import faba beans from Europe without significant insect damage and so on. So that's another factor why Australian are preferred. This being said, Australian are preferred, but they also command a higher price in Egypt for that reason. So the Egyptian importers will generally pay a premium for Australian over European.
Well, okay. Is the Australian government doing enough for its Australian farmers in helping to increase the legumes trade between Australia and Egypt?
Well, the Australian government is pretty much letting the market work compared to European countries and some other countries in the world. The Australian government does not get heavily involved in sort of trying to manage the market. But we have a very good cooperation, sort of private-public cooperation with universities, ag-research companies and communities. We've done the research and was producing year after year new varieties that are very suitable for Egypt. As far as trying to grow the production, the government, I would say, does not get involved in that. There are several reasons faba beans are grown. They're good for soils. They're part of a crop rotation for farmers. Farmers primarily grow wheat in Australia, then barley, then canola, then a variety of pulses, which you need to sort of alternate your crop and fight diseases that come if you keep growing the same crop year after year. And then pulses such as faba beans, chickpeas, peas, also called legumes, are very good for soil structure. And soil fertilization. They fix the nitrogen that's in the air through the roots and basically leave the soil in better shape for the next crop, which could be wheat or barley or canola. So farmers pretty much have a natural rotation where they will alternate wheat, barley, canola, pulses, which could be peas, chickpeas, faba beans, lentils. And then the market price is also a factor. If canola is worth $1,000 a ton to the farmer and faba beans only 300, well, they will go to more canola, less faba beans. This coming year, we think faba bean production will increase because canola prices, wheat prices, everything has been coming down, where faba bean prices have remained pretty high. So you have several factors. You have the agronomic factor. Farmers need to have that rotation. And then you have price. Farmers are also business people and they need to make money. And they will go for the crops that produce the best returns, financial returns.
Francois, the couple of the other things is the we've got the percentage of our export, the Australian export of fava beans that goes to Egypt. How much of that really goes into human consumption?
Oh, I would say 100%.
Wow, that yes.
In Egypt, I'm not aware of yet of any faba beans being imported for animal feed.
Right.
And I'm not aware of protein extraction industries yet. Yeah. I'm not saying they don't exist, possible, but it's really 100% of imports are for food. Now you have a processing byproduct when you dehull faba beans and split them to make falafel. Yes, you do end up maybe with a percentage of byproduct that gets resold locally for feed, but that's only a byproduct. It's really a food product in Egypt. I'm not aware that they import them for feed or for protein extraction as you start seeing here in Australia and in other countries. But it could happen anytime. I mean, it's
yes. The last time I spoke to Mr. Nick Goodard, we spoke about the 10%, roughly about the 10% of Australian fava beans is going towards protein extraction, and there's now quite a number of reports about that being established in Australia. How is that going to affect the overall yield of fava beans in Australia?
So I think it's welcome for Australian farmers. It gives them another market, a more diversified market. Most faba beans go for export, but in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen more and more domestic buying for animal feed. And then also in the last 5 years, I think we've seen at least 2, maybe 3 protein extraction plants. There's one in Horsham and one just outside of Ballarat. Yes. That is still very small. Right. If you think of an Australian crop of, say, the last 2 years, average is maybe 700,000 tons produced in Australia. Yes. Those protein extraction plants that I know of in Australia may only be buying 20,000 tons. Right. It is still a small sector. There are question marks whether it is going to grow exponentially or it's a bit of a fad, and there's already in the world an overproduction of proteins extracted not only from faba beans, but from peas, from lentils, from other pulses. And is the end market, the consumer market, really there for all that protein powder or protein liquid? I'm not sure. So it is still small. It may grow, but I don't think it will become the dominant market share for Australian faba beans.
Francois, just this year's yields, Australian fava beans yields, how are they traveling? What's the
okay? So at this point, so our harvests are in October, November, up to December in parts of Victoria. So I can only speak about the last crop, which was harvested in October, November. The yields were a bit inferior to the year before The year before, if you recall, we had this La Nina phenomenon, which resulted in really very, very heavy rainfall, including flooding.
Yes.
Rain, there's an old saying, rain makes grain. So while the media was really focusing on floods and crop destruction, overall, the yields were the best ever, and we had the largest crop ever.
Wow.
With quality implications and some losses, but still overall, the production was the largest ever. So this last year, so harvest November, December 23, lower yields because we had a drier year. Also slightly reduced area grown into faba beans because of higher prices for other crops such as canola and wheat. The next crop, who knows? I mean, we will need rain, as we always do. The thinking is that the area sown to faba beans will grow, again, because of relative prices. So faba bean prices have gained relatively against other crops. But really, we need some good rains in April, May to provide good germination. And then in Australia, yields are really made in September, October. In the springtime, when crops start really growing, requiring a lot of water to flower and produce pods and produce grain. So we need rain really in March, April, and then September, October. And the BOM is starting to say we may be switching back to a La Nina pattern. Let's hope it's true, because again, rain makes grain. So a good rainy winter will produce bigger crops.
Right. Okay. One of the things that we've seen in the community, locally in the community, is the large amounts of canned fava beans that's been imported. Any possibility, any talks about Australia having its own canning production?
That I really don't know much about. My gut feeling is, the technical knowledge is not a problem. Canning is not rocket science. It can be done. I get the feeling a lot of canned foods in these countries are imported. It's just a matter of economies of scales. Australia is not a huge market. And there are probably countries around the world who can mass produce canned foods cheaper than we can here. So I don't know. You can buy in Australia packaged, so dry faba beans, packaged, split, or locally made falafel from Australian faba beans. I have never seen canned faba beans here produced in Australia, but who knows? There might be some micro niche companies doing that. Also, I think people have a preference for non-canned foods. I think canned foods have this image that it's not very healthy. There's a lot of salt added and whatever. And I think people would rather buy a packaged product that looks fresh and hasn't been processed at all. Maybe that's my personal view only.
I think you've got my mother would share the same. Egypt holds an annual Africa Cairo trade event around December. Australia also puts on similar grains and pulses and legume events around June. Will you be attending these upcoming conferences, and what would you like to see at these events, Francois?
So the one in Egypt I've never heard about. So the answer is no, I've never gone and I am not planning to go.
Right.
The one in Australia in June. So in July every year, we have the Australian Grain Industry Conference, which covers all grains. That's generally in Melbourne, so normally I attend that. And then every 2 or 3 years, there is an Australian Pulses Conference. Not sure what the next one is. I have not heard of one in June, but could be wrong. So if it's an Australian conference, I would probably attend. The one in Egypt I've never heard of. And, in faba beans, in the grand scheme of things, are a very, very, very small trade compared to wheat, compared to meat, compared to other products. So, yeah, I will go to Egypt 2 or 3 times a year, visit customers, but not attend a local conference. Yeah.
Mr. Francois, I did say right at the beginning, it is an absolute privilege to have you and giving us your very informative information about fava beans. We're very grateful that you've allocated the time. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.